Can I drink coffee during? Is that okay?
Absolutely, do whatever you know. Not you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Not quite whatever you want. Yeah.
There is a funny autistic story I should tell you about. You can do whatever you want,
Mhm.
because obviously we take that literally.
Yes.
I don't think I told you about the Australian story when me and my mum took me to Australia when I was 14, and we went to stay at my mum's friend's house with her husband, who had emigrated out there from England. And obviously we got the normal welcome of, our house is your house, just do whatever you want. So they went off to work, and it was the Atlanta Olympics, I remember, so it would have been 96. And I was watching the Atlanta Olympics, and mum comes down the stairs and goes, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I was like, "I'm watching the Olympics." "Yeah, but you're just in your boxer shorts." I was like, "I was told to do whatever I want." "Yeah, but they didn't mean that." So why did they say it? I think that's pretty much symbolic of everything we're going to be talking about today, no?
And that sums up autism.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that's why it's funny, is in the good way funny. I think we'll be talking a lot about detective work today, and for sure, some of the great detectives were autistic, but also Frank Drebin from Police Squad is clearly autistic. So, it is funny because it's to the point, it's literal, and it's hilarious. But there are some challenges.
There are some challenges, aren't there? Yeah. Right. So, hi everyone. Today I'm chatting with Hubert, and as you got from the beginning of this conversation, Hubert is autistic. And this is going to be an interesting conversation. He and I have had lots of conversations about this. So I've got a vague idea what it's all about. And part of this conversation is to give you an idea of how complicated it is, because neurodiverse is tough, neurospicy is very tough, and autistic takes it several steps further, doesn't it?
It feels as such. Having spoken to many neurodivergent people, it feels that they all have their challenges. It feels like the journey, for example, that the dyslexic community has taken over the last 30 years is amazing and outstanding. Their life was very tough. I think it's slightly easier now, but never to underestimate those challenges. The ADHD lot can't be easy. Can't be easy. But I have spoken to people who have both ADHD and autism, so the infamous ADHD crowd, as they're known. And their general opinion is that their ADHD tempers their autism, and their autism tempers their ADHD. So it does feel that the pure autistic characteristic is the most intense, right, internally. There's not really anywhere for the energy to go.
This is your platform to tell me a little bit about it, or a lot about it. And let's start with, when did you find out you were autistic? In fact, first of all, are you autistic, or do you have autism?
I am autistic, and actually it feels like the word that's mostly coming to the fore recently is I am an autist. And I think that's both a development of the autistic word, but it's also a process, I feel, that we're moving away from labels that are clearly out of date. And there's the whole genesis of the word, which comes from 19th century observations, which are partially relevant, but nowhere near relevant enough to be putting labels, such intense labels on people. And fundamentally, it's misleading, because the word derives from the Greek, I believe, autos, which is self, i.e. self-focused, self-obsessed, and that is a external observation of us. It is not actually what we're feeling at all. So I think slowly we're moving away from the word autism. I think that's why there's a feeling that we're moving towards this maybe bridge concept of autist. I think a lot of us are artists, which maybe is a side point to that. But hopefully there'll be new terminology for it, because I feel we have no correct terminology. But yes, to use the current jargon, I am autistic. I was born autistic, and I will die autistic.
So there's no cure?
There's no cure, because it's not an illness.
Drugs don't work. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that won't work. as you said, there's no cure. It's not an illness. It's something you live with. It's something that challenges you. Explain to me, explain to me an average day. Would that be a good way of doing it?
I would say the question would be, what is it like to live with blue eyes? I live with it. And then you can go into, I look in the mirror, I see they're blue, I like them, I don't like them, I've got this kind of hair, it goes together, whatever. Obviously, autism maybe is a little bit more complex than that, but fundamentally, it is what it is. The challenge comes from when the rubber hits the road. So when autism hits the neurotypical world, that's where the challenge comes, because by itself, and I remember as a child being self-contained, I may as well have been the happiest child in the world. I mean, I was just one huge bundle of energy that sometimes just had to be sent away to the other room for being too happy. So, autism alone is pure happiness. The infamous phrase, when you met one autistic person, you met one autistic person. So I'm partly going to speak for my community and partly I'm going to speak for myself. But I myself could spend, hours analyzing this floor, and the patterns of wood. And I would be delighted just doing that for a while. Many of my neurotypical friends would find that boring. And so it's at that age, or even now, maybe, if I found the peace to do that. So yes, I am, but I only found out about this last year. So I found out at the tender age of 42, which is a common story. Something that I have started to take up my MP and hopefully the health minister in the UK, because I feel that the level of knowledge in our society was not good enough, considering the literature already from around 1980 was there to start pointing to the fact that there's a hell of a lot more autists than were assumed then. Most of us were not identified. And so now we have this huge cohort of so-called late identified or late diagnosed, however you want to put it, autists, sometimes referred to as the lost generation. And, in part, I understand why.
Okay. So lost generation, what does that mean?
Well, when you find out that you're autistic, the common occurrence observation within the community is that you go for a period of grief, because you basically go back for every moment of your life and work out that you didn't make a good or bad decision. Most of them look bad, but you were actually making the decision wholly in the wrong context. So it wasn't that you played the game badly, the game of life. I don't know if you remember, but when we were both young, there was a board game called Game of Life. We put little markers in the little car, and you drive the car around the board, and the board had school and university and adult life and all the rest of it. And you could have children that you put in the car with you. So traditionally, you'd kind of look back at your game of life and go, well, I did this wrong, right? I did this wrong, etc. But it turned out that I don't even know what analogy to use on that one, actually, but I was playing a whole different game. Everybody was playing the game of life, and I was playing Scrabble. It was or indeed, I was moving around the game of life as opposed to in a car with little dots for myself and potentially my partner and my children. I was trying to do the same, but with a domino piece, and I was just driving around in a domino piece, pretending that I was playing the game of life. I think that would be as good as it gets on that one. So there was no real chance of anything sticking, because I was bumping against the edges and just kind of going along the outline, school and university and work and relationships. I was there, but I wasn't.
Why were you not there? What was missing?
So again, another very well-known concept now, also in the literature about autism, the concept of masking. So basically, an autistic person is primarily led within the brain by, as I understand it, the prefrontal cortex. So we approach pretty much everything in life, and sometimes it does feel like everything in life, as a very high-end problem to be solved. And so, and that includes everything from going to the bathroom all the way up to actual real high-end problems to be solved, like, I don't know, physics equations or whatever else is challenging to make a decision on or to work out how it works. So we kind of overuse this tool. I think for an evolutionary purpose. And certainly what I looked at when I was going through the various stages of life, or what are the rules of the game? And based on those rules, how do I fit in? Now, that kind of sounds like maybe everybody's journey, but what I found talking now to my neurotypical peers about this, their working out of the rules of the game was, I would say, in less detail and more natural, more generic. And once they worked it out, they kind of went with the flow, which is quite a well-known phrase in our society. Just go with it. Just relax, man. Chill out. Yeah. As my mum would always say, just enjoy the weekend. Just lay your hair down. When I had, for us, and certainly for me, as soon as I work out one context, even if there is stability within, for example, a young person's life. In mine, there wasn't, which didn't help because I moved between countries and schools, so that's always difficult for anybody. But even if there was a period of stability, my brain is forcing me to always work out, okay, but what game is really going on here? What's really going on here? And obviously, with the older you get, the more you do see that there are more underlying games here. The infamous adage, the adults don't seem to know what they're doing, which actually I don't feel my neurotypical peers really overanalyzed. I was certainly analyzing it from about the age of 8. And I actually remember the day when it happened. I walked into my living room with a Lego Formula One toy that I'd built. I was incredibly proud of. And I walked into the living room and my mum was there with some friends. And I presented this car saying, the game is I'm a child. You're meant to get really excited by the fact that I'm doing this shit. And so there was a kind of like a nod to, great, off you go to play by yourself now, mate. But for me, that was just this huge, right, so the adults are actually playing a whole different game and they don't seem to be consequential in what they do because one day they're interested in what I'm doing, the next day they're not interested in what I'm doing. So I hope that shows just how it starts getting really complex already by the age of 8. You're already in this walking calculator. So what happens is you're in this you're in this never-ending problem solving mode because your brain keeps forcing everything to be a problem to be solved, a high-end problem to be solved. So this is why autistic children, we were known as, I'm sure we still are, as deep, as, little professors, adult before their time, always more confident speaking to adults than their peers because we're already solving problems way ahead of our pay grade. So we're never really there because we're always in some sort of version of a future solution to a problem that we're currently dealing with. So we're never really enjoying the moment as it is, unless we can really be autistic. But with age, our opportunity to be, because an autist, as I said, I could focus on the grain patterns on this floor for a long time, so I can be very present. I believe many of the people who walk this planet and around whom religions were built were autistic because these were people that were able to, well, what we now call, the power of now meditation and all of this stuff. I think that was just neurotypical people observing autistic traits and then making all kinds of theories about it. So I can be present. The trouble is that the more autistic you are growing up in our society, the more people say, well, you're a weirdo. Why are you staring at the wall? Why are you not talking right now? This is a moment that you should be talking. Or would you like me to say? Or I'll say anything. Off we go into these, directions, which means that with time, you become more and more of a masker, to go back to that point. So you more and more hide your natural autistic traits. You're still problem solving, so you can't stop that. But in your behavior, you're going along with the crowd and you're trying to be cool, whatever that is at the time. And obviously, some of us have a bigger opportunity to do that because, for example, I was ready to be tall. I could play rugby. I could, I wouldn't say I was the most popular boy at school, but at least I could speak to the popular lot and kind of, in the end, go to the pub with them. So that kind of made me popular enough to get away with it. But it really doesn't matter because behind the scenes, wherever we are on, in the social pecking order, we're still suffering immensely by about the age of 13. Now, I'm not sure how it is now with people who may be children who know they're autistic. And I actually think they've got other challenges that they may have. I think there's a whole topic area to be discussed about that, because I have no problem with young people knowing they're autistic. I have a problem with autism being a medical condition. So the fact that these young people are immediately being kind of labeled as, terminally ill, I think that's a whole different issue that would require maybe a separate podcast. We had nothing in the sense of, so maybe, I didn't consider myself, of course, long term or terminally ill. And certainly I could fit in more or less, and at certain times I'd be applauded by whether it be parents or my peers or whatever. But at the age of 13, I was, staring from my bedroom window, which was on the second floor, looking down into the garden, thinking, I think I'm going to throw myself off here, because I'm not really comfortable in this existence. This isn't for me. This isn't something that I want to be involved in. And it was only, I think, the few parts of my, again, and there are teenage autists who are killing themselves, and I think they're killing themselves now, as far as I can see. I'm sure the online world is not helping in many ways. I had enough in my life in terms of an ordered room, an orderly room. It's very important for us. So I had an orderly environment that I could, small one, but one that I could control, which kind of kept me alive. But, this is, my neurotypical peers were not standing at windows thinking about these things at 13.
There's so much there, isn't there? There is, why was it so difficult? You also touched on the fact autists perceived things differently. It's not from the reptilian brain. It's the other way around. So everything is black and white.
Yeah, exactly right. So obviously we're still connected to the reptilian brain, and we've still got needs. All of them, all the carnal stuff is going on in us. But all of that, including the carnal stuff, is overlaid by, I heard recently, and this is, just to be clear, I'd rather not be autistic. So everything that I say from this point onwards, please take with a pinch of salt. I think it was Elon Musk who's, well, officially autistic, said that if anybody spent an hour in his head, they would not want to have anything that he has in exchange for that. They would give everything away. So everything that I say is absolutely with that in mind. I've heard the theory that autism is kind of evolution pushing the boundaries of humanity towards a human 2.0. Mm-hmm. And I can go along with that. As I said, not because I want to be autistic in the current moment of our evolution, because it's not much fun. But I can imagine in the future that it would be, and obviously a lot of autistic people are drawn to Star Trek, which is this kind of vision of this kind of future human, let's call it. Certainly I was drawn to Star Trek from a very young age. We do have a very different relationship with our ego. We do have a very different relationship with money. We do have a very different relationship with greed. And I think these different relationships will be necessary for us as a species to survive. So it kind of makes sense for evolution to be, and it doesn't have to be evolution. You can, if you believe in a single God and that they're running their experiments, whatever, it doesn't, whatever the theological background of this, it would make sense for there to be this potential experiment going on, because I believe all of it is an experiment. We've clearly changed over the course of time and are changing. And I believe ADHD is part of that as well. I believe the whole neurodivergent spectrum is part of that. And I believe that's why there are more people with learning difficulties within that group of people, because it is somewhat of an experiment in the positive sense of that word. Because I don't believe we're, mice in a laboratory, all of us. But clearly, evolution, things come and things go, and certain species stay and certain species disappear. And theoretically, we know this planet one day is going to disappear. So there's plenty to be thinking about in terms of how do we move forward with all of this knowledge. And, even though we do move along by our own thought, there does seem to be things that are bigger than ourselves, and certain patterns that seem to be going back 14 billion years. So I can see autism as maybe a version of human 2.0, because there are plenty of autistic traits that are really, really, really useful, looking at the problems that we have currently in our society, in the world, and climate change, all of this stuff. I still would rather not be autistic. But it is what it is.
That I can understand. I mean, obviously, I know a lot more than we've discussed so far. So I'm just trying to think where we can really highlight what are the biggest challenges. I mean, one that we talked about before we came on was honesty. And neurotypical people lie. It seems to be our whole society is ironically based on that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you laugh at your boss's jokes because you want to stay friends with him, and you conform, you wear a mask, you pretend, all this kind of stuff. And we know we're lying to each other. We know we're deceiving each other. And how does that work for an autistic brain, an autistic way of perceiving the world?
This is certainly one of the big problems for us, and I would say this is pan community. So wherever you are on the spectrum, and that's another topic which requires another podcast. What is a spectrum? And no, we're not all on the autistic spectrum, but I'm not going to go into hyper focus on that at this moment in time. But directly in relation to your question, I believe that the vast majority, if not all autistic people, have a. So I'm not saying that we know the absolute truth. It's not about us having some sort of, special connection with the ultimate truth. It's not about that. What we do have is a very strong need for order, and within that order there is a right and a wrong. Now, we can sometimes get that order wrong. I mentioned that maybe some of our major spiritual figures in the past were autistic. I would say some of our major dictators in the past, hint, were also autistic. So, you know, you got to take the rough with the smooth. But the point is, there is a real need for a 0-1 approach to everything we do, and obviously, where society is so fundamentally based on small talk and on little white lies, which are not particularly, harmful potentially, although I would say there is a cumulative aspect there. For us, that's a major challenge because, at the end of the day, if you ask me, how are you, I will tell you. And you don't want to know. Most of the time, unless you're in the mood to know. But then
I get a nice long expression of I'm feeling this.
Yes, when we have a telephone conversation, I'll be the one first downloading because it's clear that I've got more to say. Not because I've had maybe a more intensive week. I've just got more to say. Even most probably, if you've had a more intensive week, I've still got more to say.
So that's part of the fun. Isn't it? However, and slight segue, I love. There's nothing better than having a conversation rather than "Hi, are you? What's the weather like?" Bang, straight in, deep and meaningful. I do say to my friends, "There's no foreplay, it's straight in." No foreplay. And yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, so where we're interacting with the everyday world, that becomes highly problematic. Well, first of all, it becomes problematic because we usually don't know we're autistic for a long time, or certainly we didn't. So we were really trying to work out, okay, well, if everybody is this uncomfortable, why is everybody doing it? And this was a huge paradox for me because I'm so uncomfortable with small talk and I'm so uncomfortable with even the little white lies. And not because of some ethical high horse. It's literally because it's physically uncomfortable to tell a mistruth.
Stop there. What do you mean by it's physically uncomfortable?
There is a physical sensation of discomfort when I lie. I feel physically sick.
Okay, right.
Yeah. And I'm not saying it's exactly the same for every autist.
Yeah.
I'm quite big into personality mapping, and I believe that we autists have exactly the same personality types as neurotypical people, and I believe I'm part of a personality group, which even if I wasn't autistic, I would still not really like lying in general. So I may have a double whammy on this, which is why I may be so physical. But the point is certainly, and I know autism has a part to play in this, there is a physical reaction to a lie, which is awful for me on the physical level.
So I'm just looking at that. So everything's chemical, everything's emotional. You know that whatever you are saying is untrue, or you're being told something is untrue. So you're going, that is untrue, and that tastes like pain. Let's keep it really simple. That kind of thing. There's a response to something that is untrue because it's distasteful, and then it manifests as a sort of pain in your gut or something. I can relate to that. When I'm about to tell someone a lie, I feel shit.
Okay.
So, and I hope quite a lot of people do that. I think quite a lot of people do. But I can still override that and still lie to your face if I feel I'm feeling unsafe or I want you to do something.
Yeah, but do you also feel uncomfortable if, if someone says, "How was your weekend?" and you say, "Yeah, it was great," when it was actually shit? That was a lie. Do you feel uncomfortable saying that?
I do.
Okay.
However, it's less uncomfortable than having to explain what I did or things like that. I'm weighing it up, and
I think that may be the difference. The difference is because, again, we're 0-1. So for me, and this is obviously a huge topic about in autism in terms of our executive functioning issues, which we certainly have. And I'll quickly switch analogy just to, because it'll directly feed into lying. If I've got a pile of paperwork on my desk and one piece of paper relates to a matter which is worth £1 and another matter relates to £10,000, I treat those two pieces of paper exactly the same, even though it's illogical, because obviously that's, for me to put the £10,000 issue matter piece of paper on top of the £1 issue as more important, I have to force myself to do that and actually undergo physical pain to do that. Because I'd just like to do it in the order as it lays on my desk in an authentic manner, because that's just the way I'm programmed. And lying is exactly the same. So if I, lie to you in terms of something really, really, really important, and if I lie to you, which I'm not sure if I've ever done, I'm sure I must have, maybe, I don't know. I'm sure I must have, but I don't know. But if I lie to you about something really, really, really big, or if I lie to you about, if you say to me, "Did you have breakfast this morning?" and I'll say no, when really cheekily I had a fantastic ham and cheese croissant, as it happens, then the pain. Oh, you see, this is the thing. I'm already needing to tell you the truth. Who cares what I ate for breakfast? I don't. I'm sure you don't. But because I've mentioned it, I now need, my brain's already going down that path of, just make sure it's all truthful, Hubert. Just make sure you've got all your bases covered. Not because I'm going to get in trouble, because I don't want to feel the tinge of pain. So maybe I will get into trouble in that way. It's like, so again, this is what I mean about us not being on any high horse. We can look like, we're on a high horse. Yeah. Pretty sure Joan of Arc was autistic, and she was on a pretty high horse. But that's just the way again, that's a positive perception. And just like we can be negatively perceived for being self-obsessed or, non-empathetic or whatever else people decide that our behavior points towards. So the positive stuff can be untrue, and the negative stuff can be untrue. And most of those observations are, in that sense, untrue.
I think it is hard to comprehend, but that doesn't negate the fact that that's the experience. And I think, that's one of the reasons for this conversation, is just to get an inkling that there is a very different way of being, and that's what people autists are dealing with. And you're coping in this world. Maybe not very well, but you're coping. You've had several jobs. I'd like to know what you've done. You're here, you're talking. You're not one of these savants who can fly over London and then 5 minutes later draw it.
No, I can't draw at all, actually. What if you could put me in that plane for 6 years, I still wouldn't be able to draw. You draw a couple of stick men and a really bad version of Big Ben. No. It's yeah. No, I'm definitely not a savant, although I have aspects, for example, of memory recall from the past, etc., which makes me imagine what it would be like to be a savant. And my God, must their life be difficult. A lot of challenges there. To the neurotypical world, that they're not. I heard someone wisely say that what high functioning actually means, and I would be described as high functioning. Basically, it means that you can lead an independent life. You've got a job, you've got a family, you're normal, whatever that means. But I'm sure we can all appreciate what that meant to me. But really, what a high functioning autist is someone who's just as autistic as every other autist, but someone who can hide it more for the benefit of neurotypical people. Now, you could obviously say it's for the benefit of that person because they can make more money, be independent, maybe get an attractive girlfriend. But the point is that, from my perspective, obviously, that last comment. But the point is that the pressure that comes with it is soul crushing. And I would say there will not be a larger, I know studies show this now, there is no group of people at higher risk of suicide than a mid-aged autistic person, so-called high functioning. So, we can pay the ultimate price for fitting in apparently so well when actually inside we're feeling absolutely out of sync with the rest of society. So yes, I have been independent in my life, and yes, I've worked in an incredible array of jobs. I've been an intern in the European Parliament. I've been an award-winning entrepreneur. I have been a consultant in the football industry, helping to set up football academies. But at the same time, I've also, and this is very common with so-called high-functioning autistic people, because we're so focused on creating our own little world that we can kind of semi-manage and survive in, that we often struggle to survive long term in these environments because they are so toxic in so many ways. And so in my case, there were spells that I was an Uber driver. For example, I was thinking actually on my way here of a job I had. Clearly, I must have been here with that job in the area of a mobile bookseller. I've been a van man. So basically, I've experienced the highs of success up to a certain point, and I've also done what would be considered as, menial physical labor. So I've done it all in that sense without pushing it, but a much more varied working career than most. I've had properties. I've owned a number of properties. My flat was in an interior design magazine as a show flat, and I've also spent years living with my mum as an older adult. So I've had spells of having, the most, certainly a partner that was desired by many a man in my peer group. And I've had long years of being single. Obviously, living with my mum didn't help me in that particular area. The story of a high functioning autist is usually a story of extremes. We can be, very often, I don't have the stats, but I feel that very often we have a high intelligence level. We're very good with, some of us are very good with words, some of us are very good with numbers. But at the same time, we're fighting an internal battle, which is a never ending war. Since the age of 13, since I stood on that windowsill, I've been in a battle with myself. And now I'm 44. And so that's a long battle.
Before we go there, I want to go back to all those jobs. There was 8, 9 jobs. What happened? You were in the European Parliament. Why are you still not there? What happened in each of these jobs?
The European Parliament was actually, well, it's always a good example because I studied political science and my vision was to go into public service on that, let's say, political level, international relations level. I am perfectly bilingual. I speak 2 languages at native level. So I wanted to use that to make the world a better place, literally. And this is very autistic, by the way. So there I am, my career being decided in these grand halls of the European Parliament at the grand old age of 21. My MEP, me and this Polish observer MP, Mr. Lewandowski. Hello. So my MEP is introducing me to him, and he's looking at me with this blank expression. I felt so sorry for my MEP. I know I guess she was wise enough to know this is not going to go anywhere. I was, dumb to the ways of the world, but even being as naive as I was, I knew this was not going to go anywhere. Well, certainly my gut was telling me that. My head was telling me all kinds of things, but my gut was saying this ain't going to go nowhere. That's me done then. So political science degree down the can, student loan, we'll deal with that later. What's next? Welcome to the autism, merry-go-round of jobs.
It gets to a point where it's too much and then you draw a line and jump out rather than stay there for another 5 years, bored, stupid, drinking, getting stuck in it, hating it, feeling sorry for yourself. So there is a good thing there.
Yeah, there is a part of that. Now I know I have the words to use now. I was breaking down from the age of 13. There would be systematic moments where I would break down into what I now know are periods of either autistic meltdown or autistic burnout. So these are now official phrases that I can use that describe these periods of time. These are horrendous. An autistic person during a meltdown starts to lose all their skills. From high-end skills to low-end skills, let's call it that way.
So this is really interesting. I wanted to talk to you about that. Describe to me that whole process of the meltdown, from, let's say, feelings, from what's going on, so we can really hit that point. Because
just to finish the point about jobs, this is why we can't carry on, because we even, I didn't know I was autistic, but I knew there was the risk of me having these very dark episodes. Yeah. And I knew that if I stay in a job over a certain line, I'm gonna be a dead man walking anyway. So that's why I make these decisions. I mean, to break it down, it feels like, so we are carrying this very very heavy mask. Sometimes it's heavier, sometimes it's light. Alcohol made things as usual easier at that stage. On a Monday morning at 6 o'clock. I mean, just to be clear, from the age of, well, around from the age of 13, waking up to school, and everybody doesn't like to get up in the morning. It doesn't like it would be a holiday for me. Waking up in the morning to go to school, an institution I fundamentally understood was not there for my benefits, was like someone taking a hammer and banging on my head every single day times five. And it took me until Saturday afternoon really to kind of semi recover from the previous week of that. Obviously, by that stage, it was Sunday, and you get the Sunday blues because from Monday it was all going to happen all over again. So, and I went to a half decent school for the time, and I had some good friends, and it wasn't the most horrendous experience of my life, but because I knew it was not fundamentally good for me, doing these things, whether it's education or work, are just, yeah. Um, so what happens is you go into, you start to lose your skills, and then in the end you have, so for example, I speak two languages perfectly. I can lose those languages during both or one. Sometimes I lose one till midday, and sometimes I can pick up the other one again from midday onwards. Sometimes I can write in one, but I can't speak in one. And the brain is a mysterious thing, and so this hyper-connected brain of ours shuts down from overload, which is, by the way, why people observed autistic people as self-obsessed, because it looked like we were just so in our own body and not caring about the world. The truth is we care so much, and we pick up so much from the external world, that we just become over. It's like a computer that's overheating, and the mouse thing starts to jump from place to place, and suddenly there's like a and it's not moving at all. That's autism for you. And then meltdown, is a kind of a live, emotional roller coaster, scary sensations, scary thoughts, weird physical sensations. And then burnout is Hubert. And I can hear, so for example, when I had a major burnout incident and I knew it's coming. So I asked my mum for help, because at this stage I still didn't know I was autistic, but I knew I'm going to have a dark period. And so I said to my mum, watch out for me, because this is not going to be pretty. So my mum would speak to me during burnout. So she was like, Hubert, and I can hear her talk, but I'm not going to respond to her. Because if I respond to her, then I need to kick in my whole system, and I don't have the energy to hold my entire system, my whole operating system for that. So she could be there, going, Hubert, Hubert, prodding me, and me just being non-responsive for however long, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, in the most extreme case, days. So then, my mum, for example, learning about me, this was, again, we had no idea about autism, but then she would try to find ways into my soul. It's quite a deep experience, actually. She would, read Nietzsche to me, and my mum, didn't know who Nietzsche was, but she would read Nietzsche to me, and that would somehow, he was autistic, I'm pretty sure. And his words, for example, would kind of come in, and that would kickstart something in me, like a program, or I don't know, global awareness, and through that I would somehow be able to go into the living room and eat dinner. Because again, in an autistic being, all of these programs are kind of equally important. So me going to the bathroom and me reading Nietzsche, they're intertwined. It's incredible. That's in my case. I mean, for every autistic person it will be slightly different, but there'll be things that are, the way our relatively, I think, complicated by neurotypical standards internal algorithms run. And by the way, I had a neurodiversity expert explain this to me very well. So they said to me, and this was not that long ago, so I was post 40, obviously, because I didn't know I was autistic till 42. He said to me, listen, you've got to understand, your body, your operating system is like a Formula One car. And what you've been doing is you've been putting diesel in it for 30 years. What you actually need is high-end fuel and a pit crew. I was like, well, considering the autism tax, which is another topic which I've had to pay all my life, I don't think I can afford a pit crew. And I'm not sure I can afford that level of petrol quality either. So maybe I'll just kind of, have to, and this is what we have to do in the end. We have to buy a small amount of this petrol, ration it, and do a lot less. because if we carry on at the rate that we carry on, and there is a longitudinal study in Sweden. I think this would need to be verified by other studies. I don't want to overquote it, but it would point to us having a life expectancy significantly lower as an autistic community compared to our neurotypical peers, in particular, so-called high-functioning autistic people. And I think really here we would be talking about pretty much the earliest dying group of people in our society, either through suicide or through our bodies just giving up on us, because we're always in fight or flight. Another autistic topic. We're always in fight or flight. So that takes its toll on our nervous system. It takes its toll on our bodies. So if we don't kill ourselves, our body will do it for us, because it'll go, I can't take this any longer, mate. So we do need to slow down, and we do need to really start managing our life in a very careful way. I hope as autism becomes more well known, as hopefully it changes the narrative around it, the terms that we use around it, younger people know about it, far younger. I hope this is not the outcome for future autists. But obviously, I'm talking from a late diagnosed perspective. And I say that because maybe counterintuitively, because I think actually autism is an incredible leveler. Don't get me wrong, that of course there are privileges of being in Western Europe or being male, but I think the gap between the most privileged autist and the least privileged autist is low. I think autism levels the playing ground for across gender, race, all the other areas that can bring inequality, because it's such an intensely inner experience, and it's very difficult to know if you don't go through the autism journey in a conscious way what is the best environment. Some of my best days have been when I didn't have companies and beautiful girlfriends, and it was just me in a van driving on a motorway. So I think autism is a great lever in that respect. I hope that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Every answer you give, there's 6 more questions, and it's already Thursday, and we started on Monday. So
Good.
we can go so far. But I think what's fascinating, I just want to reflect one or two things back, is it's kind of hard to choose what to do, hard to decide what's important, hard to decide what's not important. Is that right?
It would be easy if it was, if our rules were the rules of society, let's put it that way. And actually, I think very often I think we've helped create many of the rules of society. I think many autistic people in the past were our great social reformers, some of our great scientists, some of our great literary figures, as I said, the spiritual world, and the impregnation of our society with ethics and morality. I think autistic people have had a huge role within that. But I think that we often kind of create our own noose around our neck. And the great example, for example, is email, which I'm pretty sure. I mean, computers in general. Most of the great computer-related figures will be neurodivergent and specifically autistic. From your Alan Turings to your Bill Gates to your Steve Jobs. And again, don't quote me. I don't have all the proof, but look at their behaviors, look how they're perceived by the outside world. There's a lot of autistic traits there. I think we, as autistic people, created a lot of these fantastic technologies, and then they kind of became so for example, now email, which I despise. I really appreciate the autistic nature of an online communication system. But then because we're 0-1, when I get an automatic email from Vodafone, I treat it obviously equally important as an email, I don't know, from my employer with a new contract. Now, getting all of these emails, thank God for the spam filter. And I'm sure an autistic person thought of that, because otherwise I'd have to physically go through every single one of these emails. So I would never leave my computer. Now you can see some of the problems, because it's very difficult to make decisions in a world which, as I said, I think we've had a huge impact on creating, but at the same time, it then gets kind of taken over by what I would say are more neurotypical agendas, whether it's financial, and again, I think that autistic people played a huge part in creating the concept of money, but then it runs down its own course. And very often I feel it goes down avenues which are then very detrimental to us. That's what I mean about us very often creating the noose that is then tied around our neck, inadvertently, of course. So it's very difficult to make decisions. especially in the 21st century when there are already, I mean, neurotypical people are complaining about decision overload. When every single decision, including whether to go to the toilet, is being made at a strategic level, on board Air Force One with all your advisors, there's not enough hours in the day really to deal with the very many things that we have to deal with. So yes, that's why we're drawn to uniform roles. For example, we're automatically not focused on having to pick out what we're wearing that morning. That's why we're drawn to routines, to make sure we're making as few conscious decisions per day, because it drives us mad. That's why we're getting incredibly angry when someone gets in the way of our routine. That's not because we're, arrogant and ignorant. It's because we know that by the end of the day, we may not be able to speak if someone gets in the way of our routine, usually, obviously, inadvertently. We try all the tricks in the book to try to make life automatic, because if we don't, we go mad. Literally, we go mad. And many of my autistic heroes did go mad. So we have to be very careful with that.
I'm just trying to work out why everything's so hard, why there's only so much energy, why there's so many decisions to be made. I mean, you said it's as difficult to make a decision about going to the bathroom as it is to do something horrendously complex.
I would caveat that by saying it's not equally as difficult every day. There is something called autistic flow, and when we are in that state, we may find something much far easier and even I would call neurotypically comfortably automatic. But the trouble is, and especially with age and this operating system being kind of worn out a bit, zero oneness. We're often called an investigator type. Many of us are detectives by trade, I would say, and I don't mean that only in the law enforcement sense. I mean, we can be auditors, we can be people who write and or check computer code, because the point is we approach everything as a 0-1 truth game. So, when I went on a spiritual journey, this was me sitting in a Land Rover on a Swiss mountain, watching my own thoughts. I need to go to the toilet now. Yeah, but do I? What will happen if I don't? Let's run that experiment. I'm not going to go into details of these experiments, and I haven't taken them maybe to the extreme that some imaginations may imagine, but I have experimented to a certain degree with everything in life in terms of, really? Is it definitely this way? Let's check, shall we? And some of this is very interesting, and some of it's this is why autistic people break down barriers, social, scientific, literary, artistic, because we take experiments to the extreme. But you can't have that and then not on the other side have some difficulties. Like, for example, this is obvious, Hubert. Don't worry about it. We're going back to, the advice you just relax. Well, if I relax, then I'm not an investigator, because to the level that I am, because you can't just turn this off. I mean, of course, it's not constant at that level, but it's in the background. It's somewhere there in the background at all times. And especially when you're tired, especially when your operating system has been running for very long, especially if there's a large amount of external challenges facing you, you start to misfire. You start to you start to over-investigate things that currently don't need investigation, because you're in that constant problem-solving mode, because you're running. And I think, I've heard this very well described as autistic people approach life top down. So we are always looking at context. We are always looking at the bigger picture. And this includes sometimes very minor, usually on a day-to-day level, very minor topics. The neurotypical brain, wisely, from an evolutionary perspective, I believe, looks at things bottom up. How can I get the maximum result for the minimum effort? Why? Because effort costs energy. And traditionally, energy was difficult to get because you needed to eat and food was scarce. So that all makes sense. But it also makes sense that there's a small group of people that are looking at it top down, because that's why we can appear selfless. That's why we can appear odd. That's why I would say that the traditional shaman in the village was an autist. So this would be a person who'd be sitting slightly outside, wearing a wolf skin on their back, trying to understand what it is to be, doing the investigation. What is it like to be a wolf? Smelling the air, and then, people from the village would come and say, will it rain tomorrow? Well, from my observation, when it rains, you do get this kind of feeling in the air. And they'd be like, wow, you must be in connection with some higher spirit. Well, maybe, but I think more so it's just a case of very, very honest, truthful, dedicated observation. Yeah, I think that's something which has been around for as long as our society, more or less, or our vision of civilization. And as I said, going back to the earliest settlements, I think we've been here. I think we are glorified to a certain extent. If you look at the films, even from when I was growing up, whether it's Dances with Wolves, or whether it's Shawshank Redemption, or all of these films that we were kind of brought up on. For me, these were autistic figures, out in the wilderness by themselves, whatever that wilderness looked like, trying to create a new pattern, a new system to take things forward, the redemption story. So I think we play a very important role in society. The trouble is that the vast majority of autists, if not all, are leading very challenging lives. I think a large amount are leading horrendous lives. Now, I'm okay about that from an evolutionary global perspective. Of course, I would say that because I'm autistic and I take a global view. We're needed, we're necessary, but we never choose it. So I guess from an empathy perspective, from a equality perspective, from a kindness perspective, I'm very big now, and not really for me because it's kind of too late. I'll write out whatever's left, and it's not going to be comfortable either way. I'll try to make it as comfortable as possible. But for future generation of autists, what I'd like would be awareness of who we really are. Yes, we are nature's problem solvers, and that's great. So let's use that fact because we've got a hell of a lot of problems to solve as a species. So let's make sure we, give autistic people the tools and the environment, a quiet environment, an orderly environment, fair environment to help solve some of those problems. But also just from a human perspective, we've rightfully fought for the rights of everybody, women, different races, different sexuality. And as a journalist, author, Nikki Stevenson, I believe, put it in 2015 in The Guardian, I believe it was, the last great prejudice in our society that we are undertaking is against neurodiverse people. This may be the last barrier to be broken. And if neurodiverse people are recognized for who they are, not sick people, not ill people, we're 25% of the population at least. We're not a mistake. We're meant to be here. We're doing our job. It would be just nice for environments to be, also adapted to our needs, and for our challenges to be recognized because there are plenty of them. And just because we can be outstanding in something doesn't mean we're not horrendous at something else. We can be a great inventor. Nikola Tesla, obviously, I'm sure that's why Elon Musk, highlighted him by calling a company in his name. This is a person whose legacy is in every electrical socket, including in this room, and he died penniless, talking to a pigeon. So the point is, we have so much to give, but we have these challenges, and I hope if Nikola Tesla was alive today, that we'd look after him, because by God does he have plenty to give us. So it'd be nice just to give him, I don't know, maybe a nice little flat, cable TV, I don't know, Meals on Wheels. We're not great at cooking, most of us, many of us, just the basics, just to help our everyday life. So yeah, I hope that makes sense, but there's a lot there, I know.
There is a huge amount there. There absolutely is. We've touched some really interesting topics. Do you think somebody listening would get an idea of the complexity, the difficulties? Because you and I have gone into much deeper. We've touched onto veracity, on the fact that every decision preys on you. I mean, go back to that lying. There is a feeling for that lie. So a decision, there is a cognitive weight for a decision making, and for some reason you are processing every single thing rather than just like, that's not important, that's not important, that's not important, that I do, neurotypical people do. Why is that? I mean, obviously wiring slightly different.
Yes.
What about your interface between your soul, you as a person, and the outside world? I know some people touch, hearing, senses are slightly different. I mean, Is that a thing, or is that just a sort of a speculation?
Yeah, I'm going to borrow from a fantastic autistic YouTuber who runs a YouTube channel called Autistic, who very rightfully pointed out the three main traits of an autistic person, or potentially the differences between them, the fundamental differences between an autistic person and a neurotypical person. One would be the way we process emotion, specifically the fact that we process it at a different time than could be imagined. This is why very many autistic people are in prison, because if we do end up in court, we are not usually showing the same signs of remorse as that a neurotypical person, because we can process things, a year, a decade, 30 years later. So we're not, even if we have done something wrong, and I think very often we're put in court because we're suspected of doing something wrong, because again, we're not behaving in a way which someone would expect, for example, when caught when met by the police or whatever. It feels like the way we process emotions is very different, and certainly the timing of it. The second major area of difference is the way we pick up all of the sights, sounds, smells, etc. of the world. We have five senses. There is now this theory put forward amongst others, by our common friend Tim Frigg, that we actually now have a sixth sense that's developing, our sight sense, our ability to pick up non-physical inputs, let's say by our soul, or however you want to call it. Again, this very much still is if we have however many senses we have, five or six, or maybe seven or eight by this stage, or however many we're going to have in evolutionary terms in the future, we as autistic people will be picking up those things most probably more intensely than the neurotypical average. So whether it's a conversation in a coffee shop that's taking place on the other side of that coffee shop, a baby crying, the perfume, or the not so pleasant smell of somebody, I can sometimes smell when someone is ill. So someone is sitting next to me, I'm like, yeah, that person's got a stuffed, they haven't coughed yet, but I know that they've got, mucus buildup because I can smell it. Yeah. This is not practically useful on a day-to-day level. It gets in the way, because it's not just that I can smell it, it impacts me. So, I'll sit down in a waiting room, and then I'm impacted by everybody else's issues, whatever those issues are. Sometimes I'm impacted by someone's emotional state. Sometimes I'm impacted by someone else's illness, and I've got my own shit that I need to deal with. But I'm already dealing with all of these external input, which I don't want to be processing, but I'm forced to. So yeah, so that's the second item, the way that we process information coming in. And the third is this concept of veracity. And that's linked to 0-1 thinking. That's linked to truth and lies. That's linked to order. That's linked to things making sense. It's so important for us for things to make sense. It's the infamous banker in Monopoly. It's you know, as children, I would be the banker in Monopoly. I would be the one. Not only for me, it would be more important that the rules of the game were played fairly than me winning a game.
Hubert, I want to ask you about veracity, because this is something you mentioned to me, and I did a lot of research on it. And to my mind, it's kind of equating a finite amount of energy for a day, a week, a moment, or whatever. But explain this to me, to us, so we can understand why it is such a, I guess, integral part of being an autist.
So this is a concept put forward again by my virtual friend. I've never spoken to him, but someone who I very much admire, Quinn from the Autistic YouTube channel. So veracity, why I love the word is because it brings together so many aspects of the autistic need for truth, however that is perceived in the moment, order, things making sense, and the physical discomfort that we feel to varying degrees. So on all those three elements, emotions, processing of the world around us, and veracity, you'll find different autists are particularly intense and or challenged by all of them, but in different to varying degrees. For me, veracity is a huge one. It's absolutely massive. Also because of my personality type. For me, injustice at every level is something that makes it very difficult to sleep at night. So yeah, it brings together all of these concepts in one. Veracity is the need for truth, order, and things making sense.
Okay, then. So when things don't make sense, there's a cost. When things are disorganized, disordered.
I mean, huge internal suffering. Okay. So if I walk, if a film is meant to start at 9, and I mean, let's hope it starts at all, but if it's delayed for reasons, well, airplanes are a great example these days. Technical issues. I'd really want a report on that for me to be calm at an airport. If someone gave me a report, on the plane's condition, what exactly is the issue? What is that true that there was a technical issue, or is that just being given as an excuse for a plane to be late? I'd like to, understand the basics. I don't need to become an engineer, but I like to know the basics. Be able to Google it just to understand. Okay, there is a technical issue. It requires this amount of time to repair. I can deal with that. It's fine, no problem. But if disorder comes in for unknown reasons that I'm not fully sure are honest, and usually these reasons are people being lazy and or badly organized and or how the way I would perceive it. So it's a judgment call. It's not the truth maybe in that sense, but that would be, and by the way, this has a huge cost on us on the flip side, because we hold people to very high standards. We can hold people to very standards, which means we hold ourselves to an even higher standard. So we are our own greatest, I would even say to a point, slave driver. I've been a slave driver to myself, because I need to make sure, if I was an owner of a company, which means it's, the level that I held myself to for that company to be run properly, for all my staff to be fully informed of everything, for everything to run the way it should do, which is impossible because you don't know. And theoretically, the goal of an entrepreneur should be to make money, not to be a judge of everything, mostly themselves. So, which I guess is the reason why I never took that next level in terms of being able to secure a larger financial platform for myself, beyond the initial success that I had. Because we're forever, and certainly again, I'm talking about an autist such as myself, where the veracity aspect is so strong. We're forever judging ourselves and the rest of the world to an impossible standard. And I see the value of it from an evolutionary perspective. There need to be people who do this, because if we don't, then no one will pick out the injustices. No one will try to make sure that everything works properly. But the cost to that person, I mean, the cost to other people around, I've tired many a person around me because of my sense of veracity. I've lost most probably my partners, close friends because of it. I've paid all kinds of costs for it. But the biggest cost that I've had to pay is within myself, because I've held myself to a standard which, we hate education, for example, because in many ways, because we expect of ourselves already to know everything before we even enter an educational space. Because how can we, how can I give a fair appraisal of the teacher if I don't know everything already? I mean, it's literally this, as I said, an impossible standard. And I really think it's necessary at a species wide level. It's a horrendous way to live, and it impacts many people negatively on a personal level, I think, as well. But I think it's really important. So I'll defend I'll never defend my own behavior, but I'll defend the fact that there are people who have such a high level of veracity.
There's a pursuit for something. There's a pursuit for excellence. There's a pursuit for,
exactly right.
And it's not merely obsessive. It's making obsessive look like a quiet walk in the park.
Obsessive is, so I don't feel it is obsessive, but I can understand from a neurotypical perspective, someone observing me labeling it as obsessive. For me, it's process driven and it's logical. On the outside, it can be perceived as obsessive.
Yeah. And so you're just taking it to research, to learn something, to get curious, to understand, to grok, to make sense of. It's a process of comprehending something.
Yeah, I mean, we're touching on two aspects of autism. One is hyperfocus. So we have this concept of special interest, and so we can become very, very focused on, on fully understanding the English Civil War, and we will research the English Civil War to the absolute maximum, and then we'll leave it. It was like, well, that's done. We're done now with that. Now we're moving on to, English Premier League between 1994 and 2000, which was my own specialist subject growing up. So we'll have these moments. Now I don't even watch football, but I can, most probably I can still tell you, 70% of the players who were on the field during a, Manchester United versus Wimbledon match in August of 1996. I don't watch football anymore. So, this is very, very autistic. So we can have these very intense hyper focuses. In terms of veracity, I would say that's a constant aspect. So I am veracious. I'm not sure if there is such a verb, but I like it. Maybe we've invented one now. I have to. I will have to speak to Quinn from that channel to see if I can use that as a verb. We can be. I can be voracious. I am voracious about everything from the moment I wake up, which is why I try to limit the amount of things that I do, because everything I will do will be, this shirt better be clean, my car better be clean, the route to get here better make sense. No one better break any, road laws around me when I'm doing it. Everything I will do today will be impacted by this sense of veracity. Is it, is it the way I planned it? Is it the correct quality? Is it fair? Is it just?
What I'm seeing from a neurotypical, but it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And I know you well enough for you to understand that that's not from ignorance. It's a question, because there's going to be people listening going, well, just get over it.
Relax, man.
Just relax.
Just chill out. Well, that's like me saying to you, focus all the time. Just focus all the time, Hamish. Why are you not focusing all the time?
Too bloody tiring.
For me, that's mad that you're not doing it. So this is exactly the bridge that if we build, then obviously we can, we can build that in families, we can build that in friendship groups, we can build that at work. And by the way, I believe that bridge is where the greatest beauty, truth, the beautiful future of the human race lies. I believe it's on the bridge between neurotypical and neurodiverse people. You can't make it on your own. We can't make it on your own. We're all human. So we all have our, as I said, the carnal aspects, the personality aspects, they are the same. So we have this one difference, our neurological makeup. I mean, again, we have our sexual differences and our gender differences and our race differences. We have those differences, and we have this neurological difference. But on that bridge of oneness, if we're speaking specifically about neurodivergence and neurotypicality, let's call it, if we combine our powers, so the efficiency of energy usage on the part of neurotypical people and the attention to detail and pattern spotting of neurodiverse people, and also the energy level that ADHD, for example, the energy level that ADHD people bring to the table, the creativity, the hyper focus, if we bring all of that together, we can scale the summits that are ahead of us, and there are some pretty big summits. We need to really start. We don't need to be autistic to know that there are some areas of our life that are not. I'm talking about on a global level that are not going. That I'm not even saying that. I think they are going to plan, because I think they are changing, but we certainly need to carry on that trajectory of change.
I'm seeing you've got the pen, neurotypical have got the paper, and it's got to come together. That bridge is where the writing
Yeah, exactly right. Beautiful.
You've got that
Beautiful.
absolute focus of that beautiful cursive.
Beautiful.
And you've got the neurotypical bringing a piece of paper.
Yeah, and I think that I actually think that I believe that many of the people within the individual groups of people that have fought for change. So I believe a woman in the suffragette movement would have been autistic. I certainly know many of the female literary figures in England. I'm highly Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf. For me, these are very much autistic figures in terms of their behavior and traits. I believe that many of the people within downtrodden racial groups who fought for rights were autistic. I believe Nelson Mandela was autistic. I believe that many of the figures of the 60s of all colors and creeds were autistic, that were changing society at that time. So I believe that this is so the getting, for example, in England, getting in the UK, getting to the Equality Act 2010. I believe that that is part of the process that we're already on, and I believe autistic people have already played a huge part within that, without actually fighting for autistic rights, let's put it that way, but actually doing that within their own categories, or whether, as I said, whether it be sexuality or race or gender. So this is just the next step, because we are a minority, I believe. I don't know what the exact number is, whether it's 25%, maybe it's greater, but let's assume that it's less than 50. If we can get to a point where we run a society, we live a life that is not based on majority rule, I think that's an incredible step for humanity, because it's kind of illogical. It's like, well, the majority should rule. Why should the majority adapt to the minority? On the one level, that's a very illogical argument. But if you take it to if that minority has things to give that are critical, then suddenly it's like, well, maybe we should be finding ways that everybody is more comfortable. So everyone gives away a little bit of comfort to make sure that everyone is a little bit more comfortable, because then all of the traits can come to the fore. And as I said, it's happening. I mean, we're in London. This is the place that it's happening more than most. The way that this country is changing, even within the UK, is at the forefront of the way the world is going. We are becoming, you want it, you don't want it, you support it, you don't support it, doesn't matter. It's happening. We are becoming one. You've got all your colors and creeds, you've got all your genders, you've got all your sexualities, it's all there walking up and down the street. So it's happening. There's kind of two futures that you can imagine. One being the kind of depressing, Blade Runner version of it kind of working, but not really. But I think there's a second version there, because I think and I'm not talking about, blind acceptance of things and just, everything's going to work out by itself. No, actually engaging with this, actually making sure that the people who are the most enthusiastic within each of those groups that want to really come together and move forward do come together and move forward, and the rest will follow, which is exactly what's happened over the last couple of thousand years. We are in this process of moving towards something that is much more universal. And that's obviously my Star Trek hyper focus, but we're going there, and we will need to go there, because we will not solve global challenges by being in silos, however attractive silos are. And I like a silo once in a while. You can't live in the past. We are where we are, and we have global problems, and we need global solutions. And the global solutions will come from places like England, where the world is meeting, literally. We're becoming a transnational nation. So you'd like to think that this is the greatest place to be also thinking consciously about changing the narrative about neurodiversity. This is not a medical condition. Are we challenged in certain parts of our life? Yes. Are we even disabled in certain parts of our life? Yes. But are we an illness? No. Are we an accident? No. Are we some sort of experiment gone wrong? I don't think so, because it looks like we've been around pretty much as long as our civilization has. Is our civilization an accident? Doesn't feel like it. So, if we can now consciously, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure, again, don't quote me, but if you look at the people like Thomas More and Erasmus and, these medieval figures who were advising kings of the time, I believe that we have played a role already, but we live in a society now that needs to have everything defined, because in the 19th century, we decided that the written word is king, and now we need to make sure that everything is. So in that case, we neurodivergent people who could, I'm sure, do many things from behind the scenes, we need to stand up for ourselves, not to, fight equality battles for the sake of it, but to come forward and say, look, we are a group of people that have these challenges, we have these advantages, this is who we are, we're quite a big bunch, think about us as well, and we're all going to win from that. But the key thing that I would want people to understand is that I'm not at that level of ingenuity, etc. So I have a comfortable position of being autistic, but I'm not Nicholas Tesla. I understand part of Tesla's, for example, way of thinking and being. The reason he didn't have money in the end is because he didn't care about money. And that means he could give 100% of his energy to thinking about electricity, which is pretty crucial today, I would say. I think Jane Austen, great example from the other female autist, or Marie Curie, we're talking about people who are wholly dedicated to their art, whatever that art was, whatever the science was, we use Nelson Mandela as a modern day saint. The power for power's sake is a waste of time. Our relationship with money is abstract. I don't really get it. When I'm hungry, I eat. When I need to buy petrol, I put petrol in. And that's why very often I run out of money, because I just do things that I need to do. And suddenly it turns out that money can be a finite concept. So the, we don't have the same need to amass. Again, we're not playing some of the healthy neurotypical games from a longitudinal species perspective of looking better than our neighbor and playing the mating game in that way. I get all of that. It all makes sense. But we as a minority, and I think as I said on purpose, so don't have those needs. We have greater, we may even have those needs, but we have a greater need of veracity, because I'm sure Tesla's need for veracity was to get that concept right, run that experiment to its end. I think Edison's priority was something slightly different. And I think that's why Edison got the money and Tesla got the pigeon. And there's no wrong or right here. It's like we're all needed. We need people who can create relationships. We need people that can create the social bonds that hold us together as a society. And we also need the people who hyper-focus on something and come up with, whether it's antibiotics or flight. Don't quote me. I don't know if the Wright brothers were autistic, but I'd bet one of them at least was. But anyway, why? Because you need that level of focus and not only to invent this stuff, you'd need that level of focus to be able to deal with the criticism. You're a mad person. What are you doing? And the average neurotypical person will go, well, the crowd is saying no, so I will wisely go with the crowd because that's my greatest chance of survival. Makes sense to me. So then you've got these mad people on the side going, well, I don't really care about survival. That's mad. I hate that about myself. The way I started my entrepreneurial career, I'd be a multimillionaire by now if I carried on with certain, if I had more neurotypical traits. So I've just, fucked myself up because I'm autistic. Great. Well, I'd like to think that there is a global reason for that. And even though I may not influence the world, I know autistic people in the past have done, and I know they will in the future. And what I'm convinced about is that if autistic people are not involved in the great projects of our time, then our species will lose out from it. And that's why I believe they will. And I believe that evolution is doing, whatever you want to call it, is doing its job. And I think neurodiversity coming to the forefront is a part of that. We're talking about this. I didn't know I was autistic. Now I do. I'm not responsible for that. There's a bigger thing going on here.
Oh, well, we had better stop. Otherwise, we'll be talking until Friday.
Considering autists have a very strange relationship with time, I'm definitely going to hand over to you at this stage.
Lots to think about, lots to consider, And I think, Hubert, we've had a great conversation. I think there's an awful lot there that people can unpack and think about and wonder about, and probably go and find Quinn and various other people who are actively talking about autism and about the strengths and the wisdom and the integrity, and go and read Nietzsche. Thank you for listening. And if you're curious about whether you're autistic, if you know you are, if you've got some thoughts on this, contact me, contact us, look up the stuff in the show notes, because this has been a really important conversation. And I think, as recently diagnosed as neurodiverse, there are a lot of people who are really questioning what's going on with life. And I think this conversation has just touched on something that allows eyes to open, ears to listen. And yeah, there's a difference to be made because everyone's got huge input for this life. Thank you very much. Till next time.